If there is one character whose arc has been near perfect in Berserk, it's Zodd. The Immortal One tends to show up sparingly in the pages of Miura's manga epic, but when he does, he makes sure that he steals the show with his overwhelming presence. There's something magnetic about the aura of this demonic chimera. Maybe it's the way he was introduced, as a cold-blooded killer that ripped many of Guts' soldiers to shreds in literal fashion. Maybe it's the fact that he's shown his adversaries honor and restraint that is uncharacteristic for an apostle. Or maybe it's just his intense bloodlust that can chill the bones of even the hardest of seasoned warriors. Zodd is captivating, to put it in a word, so in this video we thought we'd take a look at how he got that way and where he's destined to end up. Nosferatu Zodd is the oldest known apostle for a reason, and despite not knowing much about it, in this video we're going to attempt to uncover that reason and discuss the entire life of the most badass apostle in all of Berserk. So grab your popcorn buckets, because this is going to be a long one. Thank you. Let's begin. The beast swordsman of the battlefield, Zodd's rise to apostlehood and rivalry with Skull Knight. It is rare finding an apostle that has been alive for centuries, but it is known to happen. In Berserk, most old apostles were not warriors or men of repute. They accepted the God Hand's deal because they couldn't accept death on terms that weren't their own. The Apostle Wild, for instance, was active for multiple decades, close to a century, in fact. To him, life as a human must have been mediocre, filled with the mundane, because as an apostle, he decided to maximize his minutes and live life to the fullest in a way only an apostle can think of. Wild was the embodiment of enjoyment and excitement, aka spreading violence, chaos, and wanton destruction to whichever place he currently inhabited. His introduction itself was one of the more disturbing sequences in Berserk, and this is a story where a former good guy violates the very person he saved from that fate. Wild is what people usually think of when they hear the words Berserk and apostle in a sentence, and it's justified because most apostles are like him, ravenous monsters, hell-bent on doing whatever their evil minds possess them to do. But not all apostles. Some apostles ascended more out of a sense of duty rather than survival because they were warriors in a previous life, and these were the ones chosen by the God Hand to become the generals of the army of the New World. Baser apostles were meant to be scary and destructive, but their base nature could never prepare them for true leadership, resigning them to foot soldiers in the God Hand's army. Soldiers need generals to follow, however, and these generals are essentially a whole other kind of apostles, the kind that can keep its desires in check and decimate a town in the same breath. We have Grunbeld Alkvist, the leader of the Flame Dragon Knights Corps from the Isle of Grant. Grunbeld was one of the strongest knights that island nation had ever known, sworn to defend it with his 3,000-strong Grunbeld brigade. For 10 years, he kept Tudor on their heels and prevented a traditional conquest of the island until they infected the mind of the Duke of Grant. Grunbeld died as a human during an ambush invasion and was reborn as a flame dragon apostle because his fight wasn't done yet. Once he vanquished the invading Tudor force and annihilated every remnant of enemy forces within his homeland, Grunbeld disappeared, ascending to the realm of legend. His existence was rediscovered during the Kushan invasion of Midland, where he joined the Band of the Falcon several years after his last known appearance. While Grunbeld was alive and active during the 100-Year War, putting his ascension date anywhere within the last few decades, the Knight Locus could be much older than the war itself. Locus is remembered as a legendary knight who went undefeated in his entire military and jousting career and never committed his lance to one master. He was the paragon of chivalry and knighthood, so much so that generations of Midlanders have grown up on stories of his valour. Knights only achieve such a status several decades after their demise, so Locus could have easily died even before Midland's war with Tudor, and we'd have no real way of confirming it, except through his own admission. The reason for his ascension seems to be his dissatisfaction with never getting to serve a king worthy of their title. Locus was a man deeply entrenched within the politics and military of the Kingdom of Midland. As its finest warrior, he held the leverage when it came to negotiating terms of service, and we're sure there were countless interested parties. If gold and glory wasn't the reason for his eternal peregrination, then it can only be one thing, and that's ideal. Later on in the series, Locus raves about Griffith being the personification of the concept of the divine right of kings. So it's not a stretch to think that all his life he was looking for a king worthy of that right, and he found that man in his second life. The point we're trying to make here is that Grunbeld and Locus have more honourable reasons to transform, shall we say. Being knights of the realm, things like duty and death hold a deeper meaning for them than it could ever have for an ordinary geezer like pre-ascension Wild. Grunbeld ascended because to him, dying in battle on his own terms was the greatest performance of his duty as an Alkvist. Locus ascended because in his human life, he never found a master worthy of committing his blade to, so in his new one, he would make sure that he found that person and served him, no matter the cost. These higher callings give them stronger released forms and far more control over their appetites. But if we can be real with you guys for a minute here, the template for apostles like Locus and Grunbeld comes from the man himself, Nosferatu Zodd. From a canon perspective, we have zilch to go off of when it comes to understanding who Zodd might have been. He came into existence before the eclipse that occurred prior to the one focused on in the series, whereas most other apostles were created when the Furious Five were the Fantastic Four. Zodd has been a key player in 2 God Hand cycles, and he's introduced in Berserk through his reputation. In the second numbered chapter of the manga, we learn of the existence of an elusive warrior that shows up on far and remote battlefields, annihilates all sides, and disappears before repeating the cycle all over again a few months later. This warrior could have been the strongest human alive if he was taking down the numbers we're told he was, except people knew that this couldn't be the work of a man. That's because stories about this warrior had been circulating for over a century, and in the medieval era, no one lived that long, especially soldiers. Over time, his work ascended to the realm of legend, and he came to be known as the god of the battlefield, Nosferatu Zodd. In the Japanese context, the word Nosferatu is interchangeable with immortal, so technically, this war god is called Zodd the Immortal. No one knows where he comes from, why he randomly attacks entire squadrons, and how he disappears long enough for people to forget he exists, only to reassert himself all over again. But if we take a look at his attire, his characterization, and his motivations, we can work backwards and unravel the mystery of his identity and his ascension. Though there are distinctions between apostles based on their disposition and ability to regulate themselves, all apostles have one thing in common: the process through which they achieved their current bodies. While each of their reasons for forsaking humanity might have differed, the building blocks of that transaction are the same for all of them: despair, desire, and one non-crimson behelit. The behelit is the literal key to becoming a demonic reincarnation, but in order to obtain it, one must be ordained by the laws of causality. Unlike regular totems, behelits are highly spiritual objects that are tied to the fates of the people they're meant for. Their astral power given corporeal form, and their power can only be unlocked when their owners, aka the destined, decide to embrace their destinies. The God Hand often manipulates people into believing that apostlehood is their destiny, and it succeeds because it offers their targets their heart's greatest desires. To Grunbeld, that was dying in the middle of battle, covered in guts and glory, not while protecting his lover and best friend. To Locus, that was dying in the service of the divine king who was most suited to rule the world, and not a moment before. To Wild, it was the enjoyment of every aspect of life that eluded him as an old man, which is when he became an apostle. And to Zodd, it's quite literally the thrill of the fight. Even if we know nothing about Zodd's identity, we can understand a few things about his personality by just looking at his pattern of appearance and disappearance. Zodd often attacks densely populated battlefields and tests himself against scores of soldiers, if not hundreds. Once he is done, he vanishes, until another group strong enough to grab his attention emerges, which is when he repeats his vicious pattern of search and destroy. If we look at each of his appearances under a microscope, his motivations don't make sense. But when you look at them from a bird's eye view, you realize that Zodd's only goal in life is to seek and fight the strongest. What other reason could he have for showing up on random battlefields and leaving behind a feast for crows? Being an unkillable apostle, it's not like he's got a death wish. One could say he gets off on the violence, but Zodd's first proper appearance in the series makes it clear that that's not the case. To do what he does over and over again for close to a century according to rumour, and over 3 centuries according to Zodd himself, there has to be a deeper reason, and that reason turns out to be his search for the strongest. Zodd, like Grunbeld and Locus, must have been a warrior in his previous life. Considering his preference for curved swords, axes and war cleavers, we'd guess that he comes from the eastern half of the Berserk verse. That assumption is further supported by the livery we see him sporting on the rare occasion he does don armor. Zodd tends to go into battle rather lightly clad. He wears leather as opposed to the steel plates of Western knights. At best, the only protection he gives his body is wearing a breastplate over his torso, and this breastplate is carved into the likeness of a demon's head. His shoulders bear a similar design, and the rest of his body is usually covered in cloth or left bare. Zodd is an exceptional horse rider, capable of dual-wielding weapons while riding down a hill and slaughtering every man that stands in his way. He's ruthless in his fighting style, preferring to hack and slash his way through rather than stopping to display finesse. When we put all these factors together, it becomes rather likely that Zodd was the equivalent of a Mongol warrior, or part of an eastern tribe of warriors that rode horses as their primary mounts. His efficiency with melee weapons is on the level of a Viking berserker, but he clearly isn't a Viking based on his preference for blades, though he does have a Viking's mindset. Zodd lives for the fight, but more specifically, he lives to fight the absolute strongest beings that exist anywhere in the world. Given his pedigree as a warrior, we can assume that he went pretty much undefeated throughout his lifetime, and when he died, his greatest desire remained unfulfilled. Zodd wanted to go out fighting the strongest possible enemy at his peak fighting condition, and there could be a number of reasons why he couldn't, and accepted the God Hand's fiendish bargain instead. He could have been mortally wounded on a battlefield out of treachery, being shot from afar, or ambushed in a cowardly display of defiance. Even 100 weak soldiers can't overwhelm one highly trained warrior in the world of Berserk, as we've seen with Guts himself, so if Zodd was killed treacherously, he was either shot in the back or overwhelmed by numbers larger than that. But given that he possesses some of the most lethal swordplay skills in the entire series, we can't imagine Zodd being downed in a battle. No, it's more likely that age got to him before he could fight the strongest, and in that regard, he's a lot like another character from a famous dark fantasy manga, Kashimo Hajime. Kashimo is a 400-year-old sorcerer from Jujutsu Kaisen who was reincarnated in the current timeline for one purpose: to fight the strongest sorcerer ever. Kashimo was such a powerful warrior in his era that even in his old age, he could take down platoons of sorcerers without breaking a sweat. He knew that he possessed no equal and that he would likely die before meeting someone that surpassed him. This is why he accepted Kenjaku's offer to become a cursed object, so he could one day fight the strongest sorcerer of all time, Ryomen Sukuna. Zodd strikes us as a similar sort of guy in life, someone who fought and bled and won so much that he never quite found what he was looking for. When death came for him, he wasn't satisfied, so his despair and desire for a battle with the absolute strongest being in existence activated his behelit. He could have acquired said behelit as part of his travels, or retrieved it as a war trophy from one of his fallen enemies. The manner in which he receives it isn't as important as the fact that he does. Once Zodd has the behelit, he either keeps it or loses it at some point, because he seems to know about its owner-tracking GPS system. It could be that he found the behelit, lost it, or discarded it, and then found it again right before the moment of his death. When he touched it, his blood unlocked the domain hidden within it and summoned the 3 angels of the God Hand. These angels promised Zodd an eternal battle with the strongest one during the final stretch of his journey, and Zodd accepted this offer gladly. He then went on to engage every single entity that he deemed worthy of testing his new body against, and quickly came to realize that none match up to his overwhelming presence. Zodd's desire was to achieve the most extreme of vague ideals, defeating the abstract concept of strength itself. That concept could manifest through any warrior, human or apostle, and so Zodd has faced both across the centuries, hoping to come up against a worthy adversary. In order to defeat such a being, he developed a form that is suitable for combat on all 3 terrains. Zodd's natural habitat is land, of course, but with his wings, he can fly faster than most other apostles, and we're pretty sure he'd turn out to be a great swimmer as well. His horns and disproportionately large paws give him an insane reach advantage, as does his tail. His hooved feet give him an incredible boost in speed, and to say that his mouth contains the jaws of death would be an understatement. Most of all, Zodd is blessed with a power no other apostle seems to possess, and that is being able to instantly reattach severed limbs. No matter how many times you cut off his hands and legs, as long as he can put them back in their stumps, he can heal them in no time. This is probably one of the reasons why Zodd is called the Immortal, because for humans, and even apostles, losing a limb usually endangers their lives. Getting through their immensely strong bodies is difficult, especially especially with the ones that contain exoskeleton armor. But once an apostle loses a limb, they're susceptible to bleeding out, much like a human. The Black Swordsman has incapacitated many an apostle by taking away their limbs before their lives. But clearly, Zodd is different. When he loses a limb, he can keep the pressure on until he reattaches it, and then attack with renewed ferocity. No other apostle has displayed such a power, and it makes sense Zodd would have such a power considering his goal. The absolute strongest being alive should be able to blast him out of all three terrains and turn him to dust before his body can heal itself. It will take an attack of that severity to even think about stalling Zodd's onslaught, which is why the only character that could even remotely stop his rampages before the main storyline was the Skull Knight. The Wandering Wraith is by far the greatest swordsman is Berserk, far better than Guts at turning his targets into diced meat in the flash of an eye. He has the benefits of a magical horse that can move so fast it feels like it's flying, and a lifetime of experience fighting as the Berserker. Skull Knight can chop up regular apostles in literally no time, and yet the one apostle he has repeatedly failed to kill is Zodd the Immortal. Like we mentioned a few minutes ago, Zodd is the only apostle that has witnessed 2 God Hand cycles. The second one occurs during the series, so the one before that was his first proper experience of the ascension of one of his natural masters. When it comes to playing the role of demonic thrall, Zodd does it, but in his own way. He isn't the kind to rebel against the God Hand just because he can kill countless humans and apostles by himself. Zodd knows what duty is like, what being in service to a higher authority means, and he also knows that in the grand scheme of things, serving the God Hand will bring him closer to his goal than standing against them. Ironic that, as you will learn by the end of this video, but his logic is kind of unassailable. After all, the God Hand brought him in contact with the Skull Knight, and he's the only entity that has even come close to Zodd's definition of absolute strength. It's likely that they first came into contact during the eclipse 2 centuries prior to the current storyline, because Skull Knight is known to target eclipse sites over the course of his existence. He hasn't made any headway with them, and now one of the main reasons is the Immortal One. Usually, Skull Knight can cut his way through any apostle stupid enough to stand in his way, but that's because most apostles have no idea how to fight. Just look at Wild. He was able to give Guts the fight that he gave him purely based off reflexes and raw strength. There was no technique involved, no skill. Apostles generally rely on the fact that they're stronger than others to overwhelm and devour them, but Skull Knight isn't like anyone they've ever encountered. His blade has been honed to the edge of insanity and beyond. He has fought countless foes as a human and then as a wandering wraith. He knows just how he needs to approach any fight in order to win it, except when the fight is with Zodd. The Immortal One is perhaps the only apostle with the skills required to slow Skull Knight down, for neither man has ever truly defeated the other. Skull Knight has continued to stalk to endless night, and Zodd has continued his search for the strongest, though they've clashed many a time. The Immortal One wouldn't be if he wasn't as skilled of a warrior as he is, and if his body didn't possess the properties that it does. He'd have joined the long list of apostles who had their behelots swallowed by Skull Knight in the hope of creating a weapon powerful enough to stop the God Hand. But he never does, and that itself is a testament to his bestial strength. After witnessing the birth of one of his overlords and coming into contact with the entity that wants to wipe them off the face of the earth, Zodd's purpose in life must have taken on a new dimension. He was still determined to seek out the strongest entity in existence, but now he also wanted to ensure that whatever course causality was meant to take, it would take. His involvement in preventing Skull Knight from messing up the 4th eclipse would have been the closest thing to a religious experience for him. We know that all apostles feel a baser sense of servitude in the God Hand's presence, and if his intervention put him in close proximity to them, then their hold over him would be renewed. Zodd likely didn't participate in the feast part of that infernal banquet, considering he has shown great restraint over his appetites in that regard, but he did further entrench himself in the affairs of the world. No matter how small an apostle's actions might be, in a specific time period, the ripple effects would ultimately be accumulated by the God Hand to become a part of their grand scheme for the world and beyond. So in a way, Zodd was helping his masters by doing whatever he pleased, because what pleased him was the fight, the thrill of dispatching of his enemies with his own hand, the miasma and negativity that was born from his treatment of humans and apostles alike strengthened the God Hand's position in the world, because as agents of darkness, disease, death and despair are the things that they can influence. Every time Zodd killed humans, he created created hundreds of restless souls that can further haunt thousands into early graves, or worse, on a one-way trip to hell. Every time he killed an apostle, Zodd strengthened the vortex of souls itself, because all apostle souls are linked to the vortex, and when an apostle dies, their souls get sucked into it. The fear and destruction spread by an apostle become the seeds that the God hand germinates through their access to the collective consciousness of humanity, leading the entire world to a single goal. And Zodd is the general leading the charge, whether he knows it or not. While his involvement with the fourth eclipse is unclear, it is safe to say that without him, the fifth eclipse might not even have occurred. That's how good of a demonic thrall he is. And speaking of arranging the birth of the fifth, that's where we officially get to meet Zodd for the first time. The soaring falcon and the seething swordsman, Zodd comes into contact with Guts and Griffith. In Chapter 2 of Berserk, we see the newly appointed Viscount of Midland, Sir Griffith, laying siege to yet another Tudor target during the 100-Year War. In the previous chapter, he gained his new position by defeating the Black Iron Ram Lances, an elite heavy cavalry force of the Tudor Empire. The Band of the Falcon was the literal answer to the king's prayers, and while that was very on the nose storytelling for Berserk, it also showed you how drastically the course of the war had changed since the addition of the Band of the Falcon. Before Griffith's group was hired, Midland had been getting thrashed in the war. They lost the key fortress of Doldrey to Tudor, and no matter how many assaults they mounted to recapture it, they always failed. Midland's overland campaigns were all defensive in a sense, because Doldrey was the launching point for any invasion for both sides. Given that Tudor was the one in control of it, they were the perpetual invading force. And for close to 100 years, Midland kept losing land to them until Griffith arrived. He took his brilliant strategic thinking and a beast of a warrior in Guts to the King of Midland, extending his undefeated streak with Tudor blood. The Band of the Falcon were outgunned and outnumbered by the Black Iron Rams, but Griffith's tactics allowed them to achieve a total rout of the enemy. He took his efforts to capture another Tudor fortress and solidify his position in the trenches with the Midlanders, but here he hit a bit of a snag. The Band of the Falcon, now numbering 500 in strength, was big enough to make any defending army run for cover. They repeated that at this fortress and captured most of its outer structures. The place where they encountered trouble was within the inner citadel. Medieval sieges were a lot like a game of capture the flag. Simply breaking through the walls doesn't win you the game. You need to disable every enemy within those walls and capture the seat of power, which is often housed within a fortified citadel. Sieges often took months, if not years, because many a time getting through the walls themselves was a bit of an impossible task. Griffith's ingenious strategy made that part of the offensive an easy success, but the unstoppable Band of the Falcon was brought to a halt trying to take the inner citadel. What's worse is instead of a regiment of soldiers holding it down, it was just one man. Guts had sent in 50 of his best raiders to complete what is usually the easiest part of a siege, but not one man had returned alive. When Griffith's men heard reports of what was going on, Judo immediately brought up a rumour that jeopardised their entire mission. He'd heard that Nosferatu Zodd had joined Tudor during this climactic stretch of the 100-Year War, and that did explain the hold-up. Many in Griffith's band had been mercenaries before they joined up with him. They'd heard of the legacy of Zodd, the man who would show up, leave a trail of destruction in his wake, and play dead till he felt like repeating the cycle. If he was indeed the one holding up Guts' party, then the band was in a lot of trouble, and as it turns out, he was. The reason Zodd sought out employment with the Tudor Empire can be one of many things. It could be part of his random pattern of showing up and annihilating folks before looking for another battlefield. It could be that he figured he'd get a steady supply of fighters if he allied with Tudor, considering at the time their war with Midland was nowhere near its end. No one could have predicted how Griffith would upset the scales, so as far as the Tudor generals were concerned, they were winning. Zodd's addition only made them that much stronger, and it also gave the Immortal One a chance to see what one of history's longest conflicts could produce at its peak. However, what we think happened here was a combination of those things, plus the fact that he would get the chance to go up against the band of the Falcon. Griffith's involvement on Midland's behalf had been short compared to the war itself, but in that short period of time he had managed to completely turn the tide in Midland's favour, at least on the battlefields that he was deployed to. His Falcons were the fiercest fighting force the Western world had seen since Geyseric's Supreme Army, and their raider captain in particular was a nightmare in human skin. Zodd, being a connoisseur of war, must have kept tabs on the Falcons' progress, which eventually piqued his interest enough for him to want to test them out. So far, they proved to be nothing special, because he had slashed, gutted and ripped apart 50 of their soldiers, and that's without clothes, mind you. Yep, Zodd's first canonical appearance has him standing buck-ass naked in the middle of a pile of corpses, lit only by dimming torches and the rage of their former captain. We don't know if he's some sort of exhibitionist or if he really does get off on violence, but the thing to note here is the gruesome manner in which he dispatched of his enemies. The Immortal One hacked off limbs, smashed visors through heads, and straight up impaled people on his sword. As Zodd slew one Falcon after the other, he was eventually faced by their unit commander, and instantly Zodd could tell there was something different about this guy. He treated him like street trash at first, hurling 2 of his dead comrades hanging off his sword in his direction. But when Guts parried flying dead bodies and got off with a moderate back bump off a stone pillar, Zodd instantly recognised his level of skill and technique. He commended him for his move, but continued to keep up the pressure. Guts had to put his entire body weight into countering Zodd's downward slash with the hilt of his sword, and his knees were already buckling when he dodged the next slash aimed for his head. He didn't let the fact that it broke the pillar he was using as support affect his movements, because Zodd closed in with 3 lightning-quick strikes before landing a 4th that Guts was forced to absorb with his bracers. The impact when he came into contact with a second pillar knocked things loose in his back, abdomen and his left arm, but he somehow managed to stand. While Guts was freaking out about Zodd's freakish strength, the Immortal One himself was over the moon. Turns out, no one had kept him in check like that in the last 50 years, and he was relishing every second of it. Rarely does he encounter his eternal rival, Skull Knight, for a decent workout, and he almost never finds a human that can reach that level. Guts impresses him thoroughly with his survival skills, and even more with his tactical skills. Zodd's previous blow creates separation between the two of them that makes Guts realise he can't win this battle off of raw strength. He needs to rely on technique, and the only thing that was equal about the two of them was their swords. He takes a stance, and the position itself divulges his intentions to Zodd. We told you guys he's a combat genius without peer in the previous section, and his first fight with Guts is proof of it. Zodd could tell exactly what he was going to do just by reading his body language. He knew Guts was throwing down a do or die challenge to him, and he accepts, intrigued by the swordsman's proposition. Zodd comes down on Guts hard with his war cleaver, but instead of aiming for him, the swordsman goes for his weapon. Disarming an enemy pretty much leaves them at your mercy, or at least that's how it works in a conventional conflict. So Guts decided to do just that. He used his do or die strike to break Zodd's weapon, because what he was counting on was the surprise it would generate. Once his weapon was neutralized, the enemy would move their hands to protect themselves, but by then, Guts would have already leveraged the speed of his own blade. He brings it up to break Zodd's cleaver, and then brings it down into his torso, crunching through flesh, bone, and nearly both of his arms, which the latter raised in a reflexive moment. But instead of killing him, like he thought he would, Guts just made the guy stronger. This was the very first time that he encountered an apostle, chronologically speaking, and he just wasn't expecting someone to survive a vicious blow like that. Not just survive, but to also shake it off as though it were nothing, and then transform into a chimera straight from hell. Instead of keeling over and dying, like Guts thought he would, Zodd grabbed his broadsword and started laughing maniacally. As he pulled it out of his shoulder, his wounds had already healed near completely, and he praised Guts for being the only human in his centuries-long existence to bury a blade so far into his body. He was positively ecstatic by this development, so he decided to reward Guts by assuming his released form. Now, you've got to understand just how big of a deal this is. Zodd specifically points out the fact that Guts is the only human in 300 years to get his blood boiling again. This is because the only other person who does that on the regular is the Skull Knight, whom Zodd usually engages with his released form. When Guts manages to push push him far enough to release it. Zodd is overjoyed, because this is something he didn't see coming in all his life as an apostle. He knows it's an unfair battle given his overwhelming strength advantage, but he doesn't care. Guts neutralized it once, and Zodd wanted to see him do it again. He pounced on the swordsman with his massive paws and narrowly missed skewering him with his horns. He corrected his trajectory after collapsing a pillar, and a second backhand paw strike knocked the wind out of Guts entirely. Zodd was somewhat dismayed that this was the extent of his power, but he was a realist, and he knew that this too was extraordinary for a human. He proceeded to commend Guts once again and decided to reward him by tearing him apart, but before he could, a hail of arrows landed in his back. Though it only served to annoy the Immortal One, it also served its purpose. Griffith wanted to distract Zodd long enough so that he would drop Guts, and he does, all the while cursing the band of the Falcon for defiling his sacred battle. He goes berserk on the support beams and crushes many falcons to death with his actions. I mean, we did tell you he absolutely loves a good fight. To Zodd, his god is battle, and his battle with Guts was the most sacred battle he'd experienced in centuries. He wanted to savor every moment of it, but he was being bothered by annoying gnats that he could crush with a swipe of his palm. Zodd slaughtered at least a dozen of them as Griffith moved to rescue his comrade. Turns out, it was all a ploy to get to Guts, and by the time Griffith reached him, Zodd had realized the plan. He was a genius in tactics and strategy, and his momentary lapse in judgment caused by rage was never going to turn into an all-out rampage. He would always circle back to his original target, so when he saw Griffith shouldering Guts, he asked him where he thought he was going, given that his heart was still beating. Zodd challenged Guts to fight him till he was torn to pieces, and he prepared to go at both him and Griffith full throttle. Achieving that takes him a bit of time, we suppose, because it was enough to allow Guts and Griffith to cut through Zodd's flesh and avoid his charging body. The latter even managed to score his left arm and circle around him gracefully, but just as Griffith was about to reach Guts, Zodd's tail thwacked him into a pillar, rendering him unconscious. Guts tried to make a stand, injured as he was, but Zodd used his severed hand as a club to swat him aside, before effortlessly healing himself. He was overjoyed that he found two humans that could give him such a fight on the same day, but also deeply saddened because he knew that he'd won, and now he was going to have to kill them. Zodd likes to go all out against enemies that earn his respect, and Guts and Griffith both clearly managed to do that. Guts more so because he held his own against Zodd in both base and released form for quite a while. But in the end, neither of them possessed magical weapons like a fire-breathing dagger or a sword that cuts with the wind, nor did they have armor that could make them surpass their limits and fight until the threat in front of them was eliminated. They were purely human, and that made them fragile little things. Zodd decided to keep the man he respected more for last and went to finish off Griffith, but this is where his entire life turned on its head. Up until this point, Zodd had been a loyal soldier of the God Hand, following the call whenever needed and following his will when operating on his own time. It was really helpful that his actions contributed to the overall scheme of his masters, but apart from fending off Skull Knight and participating in the fourth eclipse, he hadn't shaped the world of Berserk in a major way. That changed when he loomed over Griffith, preparing to deal death to him, and froze in place upon witnessing his necklace. It was a strange stone, wrought in the likeness of a misshapen face, crimson as a drop of blood. The person that gave it to Griffith told him that it would give him the world in exchange for his flesh, and turns out there were some legs to that claim. This is because Zodd identified this egg of the king as the Crimson Behelit, one that was only imparted to those destined to become a member of the God Hand. Because Zodd had lived through a God Hand birth, he knew what it took to make one. Many apostles don't even understand the nature of their ascendants, let alone the astral intricacies involved. Zodd has lived longer than most of them, however, and being a merchant of death, one of his skills is researching everything. He knows the nature of a behelit, how it functions, and which colour it needs to be to signify real change is coming to the world. He couldn't believe that a cub like Griffith could have it in the first place, which suggests that the God Hand of the fourth eclipse was in their twilight years when they ascended. More than that, Zodd's disbelief is over the fact that he met his next promised master on a hunt, and that he nearly killed the angel before it could be born. So when he understood the game game at play, he broke into a laugh and decided to see how things played out this time. Zodd punched a hole through the ceiling of the inner citadel and informed Guts that their battle was on hold for now, though he wondered whether they would ever be able to pick up where they were leaving, considering the new reality of their lives. The camaraderie between Guts and his promised master had not escaped the eye of the immortal. Zodd was an old ballerina at this dance of death, and he knew that this bond was one of the many that Griffith would have to sever in order to ascend. He had no idea what the man himself thought of his soldiers, but his actions at least proved that he cared about them deeply. Why else would he run to save one man and sacrifice 12 in his stead? No, such a thing was only possible if true friendship existed between Guts and Griffith, and he was right, though neither man could openly admit it to themselves. That did not matter, however. The things left unsaid are often truer than the spoken word, and Zodd could see the lines of causality wrapped around both of these people. He warned Guts that their fight was only on hold till next time, but he wasn't sure if he'd ever see him again, because if he was a true friend of Griffith's, then he would be leaving this earth real soon. When Griffith's ambition collapses, an inescapable death will pay a visit to Guts. This is the prophecy that Zodd leaves the swordsman with as he sprouts massive leathern wings and flies off into the night sky. The falcons watching outside, wondering whether they're witnessing a demon or the devil himself fly away, but the ones inside know the truth. Monsters like Nosferatu Zodd exist, and to Griffith this became further proof of his divine purpose. In a way, he did not resent what had happened, because it showed him gods and demons do exist, and to him that meant that destiny must exist as well, and that the fortune teller's prediction could one day come true. He didn't know how giving up his flesh would give him the world in exchange, but encountering Zodd made him realize that it could happen, and that just reinforced his drive to become king. Griffith re-entered the field of battle after recovering from his wounds with a renewed conviction, unaware of the fact that his conquest was no longer his own. By coming into contact with an apostle, he had revealed the location of the fifth chosen one to the God Hand and its thralls. Up until now, they had only influenced his actions through thought and feeling, but now they could involve themselves directly. Whether it was because he made first contact with the fifth, or because he was the strongest thrall in their service, Zodd took it upon himself to see the God Hand set completed, and that included guiding Griffith in the right direction, even if he didn't want to take it. So after leaving him unconscious and his friend reeling, the Immortal One got to work on preparing the world of Berserk for its nastiest event by far, the eclipse. The Unseen Guide of Causality, how Zodd set up Griffith's path to the eclipse. Once Zodd realised that the birth of the fifth was afoot, he wasted no time in getting to work on preparing for his arrival. He gathered as many apostles as he could, or sought them out in the wilderness, all with the intention of informing them that the eclipse was at hand, and no one was to touch Griffith because of it. Zodd knew that causality had a way of fulfilling itself, but he also knew that a few nudges in the right direction would go a long way. After all, destiny can only play out as intended when the one it is intended for accepts it. So in order to ensure that happens, Zodd helps matters along by informing his fellow apostles about Griffith and then keeping watch over him from a distance, keeping him alive and safe from harm until the opportune moment arose. Zodd started shadowing Griffith's army after their encounter because he knew that at some point his intervention would become necessary. When he realised that Griffith was the one bearing the Crimson Behelit, he exclaimed that this was that kind of ploy. Evidently, Zodd knows a lot more about the core mechanics of how the God Hand operates than any other apostle, because it seems like he is able to understand the trajectory Griffith's ascension will take even before it gets there. He observes the strong bonds of friendship that tie him to his troops, but he can also sense that Griffith is unaware of this. To him, he's protecting the assets with which he will build his dream, so it was extremely important for things to get better for him before they got a lot worse. Life has a way of taking men of great ambition to the peak of it, and then dropping them down just to see how they handle it. Those who survive the fall emerge with characters and wills stronger than anyone can imagine them being. Those who break hard and allow themselves to be influenced by every factor that is meaningless except their own thoughts and feelings. This was going to be a gamble, but knowing what he knew about causality, Zodd must have been confident his side would win. We can't think of any other reason reason for him to just casually assist Griffith in one of his most important victories, where just a few months ago he was trying to kill him. The fortress of Doldrey was a key fortress, not just because it kicked off the 100-Year War, but also because it was said to be impenetrable. Built upon the banks of the river, divided Midland and Tudor, controlling Doldrey meant controlling all routes into the latter's territory, and its layout was such that a conventional siege would surely fail. Griffith used a combination of diversion and infiltration tactics to take the fortress, and the fact that it was being governed by the biggest stain on his military career made things a lot easier for him. Griffith was an excellent judge of character, so when he found out that Governor Gainon was commanding Doldrey, he knew the old lecher wouldn't be able to resist sending his men after him. By this time, the band had grown 10 times in size and was pretty much a part of the Midland Royal Army, yet it was no match for the Purple Rhino Knights, the best cavalry division under Tudor command. They were far better equipped than the Falcons, and their forces were undivided. Griffith's plan was set to unfold in 2 stages. The first stage would see his main army, especially his raider crew, draw out the Purple Rhino Knights. Once the castle was left mostly undefended, Casca's unit would sneak in through the postern door and claim it, cutting off the Purple Rhino Knights' retreat. Trapped between a river and an impregnable fortress, the Falcons would then slaughter every Tudor man standing against them, thereby allowing Griffith to silence Gainon before he spilled their secret to suspecting ears. It was an ambitious strategy, and they were outnumbered 6 to 1, but the Falcons had routed greater odds before, and besides, Guts had recently earned his 100-man Slayer title. If everything worked out as planned, they'd be the ones executing a pincer move and trapping Tudor's entire Northern Front army in an arc of death. Almost as soon as the assault began, things started going wrong. Griffith had anticipated that Doldrey would be left lightly defended once all the Purple Rhino Knights sally out, and Casca's key mission would go off without a hitch. He was wrong, and the female commander of the Falcons found herself fighting Aidan Coberwaltz and his Blue Whale Knights once again. Out on the field, Griffith effectively put his men between a river and an army, so as to force them to stand their ground and fight for their lives. He was banking on Guts being the nucleus of their effort, because something about his ferocity always inspired men to fight harder. But he didn't account for the skills of the Purple Rhino Knights general, the man called Boscon, wielding a massive poleaxe and standing at least 3 heads taller than Guts. Boscon was the crown jewel of the Tudor defence. In their first exchange, Guts scored the horns of his plated helm, but Boscon knocked his helmet clean off his head. That alone told us that he was not the kind of guy you wanted to dance with for too long. If he had managed to retain control over the assault, he'd have annihilated Griffith's forces, but even despite that, he nearly managed to do it anyway. The Falcons' first wave of attack was a feint. Guts cut through the enemy's centre and made for the general's head, which was a common objective in warfare. Generals were the ones who controlled the flow of battle and had the authority to issue commands. If they fell, the army would scatter, making defeat inevitable. This is why large armies usually have more than one general commanding their forces. Once they'd reached Boscoin and drawn out Gainon, the Falcons retreated, and the Rhinos followed. Now, it was their turn to defend, and this gave Boscoin the opportunity to turn the tables on Griffith. He knew that being the leader of the band, he'd be extremely well protected, so taking his life might not be that easy. But if he killed Guts, the raider captain and greatest hero of the Falcons, then he would crush their morale and cause them to scatter. And he would also take out Griffith's most powerful guardian. Boscoin engages Guts, and in the exchange that follows, he comes out on top. The 100-man slayer failed to consider how his 100-man slaying would affect his blade, and Boscon's poleaxe was far sturdier than one would think such a weapon could be. He snaps Guts' sword in half with his weapon after a flurry of exchanges that the naked eye can't see. He also unhorses the man, forcing him to resort to a dagger for self-defense. Boscoin knows he's won, so he charges at Guts, taking out 4 of his raiders in the process. Everyone is filled with fear and anticipation when a godsend miracle occurs. Or rather, we should say Zodd send. The Immortal One shows up on a hill overseeing the battlefield, and noticing Griffith's ambition in danger, he decides to intervene. Zodd buffs up his arm and tosses his massive war cleaver in the general direction of Guts. The blade lands right in front of the swordsman, and as if propelled by destiny, Griffith charges him to pick it up and fight. Guts reacts instinctively at that point. He picks up the blade and decapitates both Boscon and his armoured horse, leading the charge that overwhelms every remaining Tudor soldier. He hikes his way up to the battlements of Doldre, where he meets Casca and leaves the sword behind. Something about its sudden appearance and familiar design irks him, but Griffith doesn't care. To him, victory was his sole focus, and now that he had achieved it, he could tie up all of his loose ends. Little did Guts know that he was right to feel weird, because off in the distance, Zodd mutters to himself that the eclipse will soon come, and with it, the demonic advent. There can be several reasons for his interjection, but the one that is clear is that Zodd needed to ensure Griffith's survival more than his victory. He had been surveying the battle for a good while, and he knew that the Falcons were outnumbered and outgunned. When he saw Guts being pushed to the brink of defeat, he knew that if the swordsman fell, his master wouldn't reach the day of reincarnation. So to ensure that that doesn't happen, Zodd throws in his own weapon to help pave the way for Griffith. Thanks to him, the White Falcon is promoted to White Phoenix General, and all of his captains and commanders are knighted. Griffith is able to ingratiate himself with the throne of Midland to an extent no commoner had ever done before, and it was all thanks to Guts. Zodd knew that Griffith's ambition was highly reliant on Guts, whether he acknowledged it or not, so to get him to the eclipse was crucial. He also needed to bring Griffith to the highest of highs before plunging him to the lowest of lows, because doing that is what would have allowed the God Hand to influence him directly. The angels of evil do not exist in the material plane, and the little influence they do have over it comes in the form of indirect control, dreams and visions, signs and portents. These are the words with which the God Hand communicates with its chosen. Only a mind that has been broken beyond repair can perceive their true selves, and a year's worth of torture in imprisonment can do that kind of thing to a man. When Guts left his side, Griffith broke and committed treason by sleeping with Princess Charlotte. He was sentenced to the worst form of torture as punishment, and he endured it for an entire year. But in the process, his mind was broken, and it allowed the God Hand to visit him and plant the seed of his reincarnation. This seed bloomed rather quickly when he was finally broken out of his prison, but by the man he least wanted to see. During that year-long incarceration, Griffith had come to blame Guts for all his misfortunes, and his first thought was to kill the man when he saw him next. That's exactly what he tries to do in chapter 54, but his severed tendons betray him. Once rescued, Griffith spends every waking moment cursing his condition and envying Guts for his unnatural strength and skill. He had always been a unit of a man, but after their year apart, it's like he wasn't even human anymore. Guts took down every soldier sent into the Tower of Rebirth to stop him and his party from taking Griffith, and he kept fighting well after it. He easily surpassed his 100-man slaying record that day in our opinion, because he was both attacking and defending at the same time. As things stood, he was capable of fulfilling Griffith's dream with his incredible body, and that frustrated the Falcon to no end. This frustration worsened when Wild attacked the Falcons, because there he came to realise the full extent of his powerlessness. Griffith tried to help his comrades on more than one occasion, but being an invalid mute, he simply was in no condition to do so. Guts nearly defeated Wild all by himself, but the Apostle recovered just enough to hold his original target hostage. You see, Wild was affiliated with the King of Midland as the leader of the Black Dog Knights. He had been sent out as the final resort to capturing Griffith, but Wild himself had other ideas. Being an apostle, he knew that the eclipse was about to occur any day now, and that Griffith was the apparent chosen one. Zodd had relayed that information to most apostles to keep them away from him, but he clearly underestimated Wild's drive for living life on his own terms. As soon as he realised the king was asking him to chase Griffith, he leapt at the opportunity, not only because he knew what was going to happen, but also because he was to put his own twist on it. Wild lived by the God Hand imparted maxim of doing whatever he willed. His creed of enjoying exciting things was born from that charge, and he wasn't going to let even a prospective God Hand get in the way. He wanted to see what this falcon was made of, but when his soldier managed to mortally wound him, his goals shifted from capturing Griffith to using him. Wild was a conniving and cruel man, but he wasn't thick-headed. He knew that if Griffith was indeed the chosen one, then he would have a Behelit on him as proof. Wild Wild had obtained his apostle powers at the moment of his first death thanks to a behelit, so he figured that if he repeated the process, he could cheat death again. What he obviously failed to account for was whether any of his so-called brethren would put an end to his follies, because to him, that was the farthest thing from possible. Wild thought being an apostle meant he could do whatever he pleased. He knew there was a hierarchy, but that didn't come into play when he was terrorizing humans. To him, do what thou wilt was a literal commandment, a permission slip to commit the most heinous of acts and get away with them on account of being an apostle. He clearly had no idea that behelits were destiny coded for the people that owned them, and Wild couldn't be the owner of the Crimson Behelit in 1,000 years. That means he already couldn't use the damn thing, and yet kept insisting that Griffith give it up to him. When he realized that the behelit wasn't on him, he decided to kill the guy, because what else could he do? He didn't know that behelits return to their owners at the moment they most crave their power, but Zodd did. The Immortal One swooped in on Wild and impaled him with his horns for violating an unspoken guideline of causality. Thou shalt not harm the chosen ones in any way, shape or form, despite whatever suffering humans inflict upon them. It wasn't an apostle's place to change the course of destiny, only to feed into its tide. Wild was trying to course correct his own life, but that would jeopardize a plan that was laid down literal eons ago. Zodd couldn't let him do that, and besides, if it was Wild's free will to kill Griffith, then it was also Zodd's choice to rip him to shreds. He banalizes Wild over his horns and ends his life, giving Griffith the faint hope that he knew he would cling to. Zodd tells him that his behelit would soon return to his hand, because that's how it is. He doesn't know that Griffith lost it in the Tower of Rebirth a year ago, and he doesn't are. He knows how causality works, so he's confident that what he tells Griffith will come to pass. By involving himself in these two instances, both of which occurred a year apart, Zodd ensured that Griffith's only requirement moving forward would be the acquisition of power. He didn't have to explain what was about to happen. Destiny and intuition had a way of finding each other. Zodd knew that at this moment Griffith felt as powerless as a corpse. He had nothing to his name, and his body was worthless. He couldn't move his limbs the way he wanted to, and he couldn't even give out verbal commands. Witnessing Guts' strength over his would make him crave power of his own, and that's all Zodd needed to draw out of him. That desperate desire to escape one's current constraints and ascend to a position where they can realize their dreams, no matter how blood-soaked they might be, that's the offer the God Hand gives to those who join them. And as a member of the God Hand itself, Griffith would be blessed with much more than that. Having nudged him in the right direction, Zodd headed for the site of the eclipse, not to partake in its madness, but to defend it. For 300 years, the Immortal One had been protecting his master's interests and guarding temporal junctions to the best of his abilities. With the birth of the fifth being the last in the cycle, Zodd knew that his eternal rival was bound to show up sooner or later, and he did. In Chapter 80, Skull Knight manifested outside the eclipse point, just as Griffith was nearing the end of Ubik's manipulation ritual. His intention was to force his way in and break up the ceremony somehow, but a familiar foe was waiting for his arrival. When Skull Knight asked Zodd if the God Hand had directed him to guard the eclipse, he denied it and said that it was business as usual. Now, this might be true, and Zodd could have just been looking for another fight with the closest candidate to his definition of strength, but he must have also known that doing so protects his master's interests. The two engaged in a short yet fierce conflict, which saw Skull Knight emerge as the victor. He lopped off one of Zodd's arms, as we're sure he's done several times in the past, and broke into the hurricane that was the eclipse. Skull Knight couldn't stop Griffith's ascension, but he did manage to escape with Guts and Casca in tow. Not that it mattered to Zodd. He was concerned with finishing their fight, and he was enraged that Skull Knight had bypassed him like that. Barely a moment had passed in the physical world when the wandering wraith emerged with Guts and Casca in tow, but Zodd wanted to settle the matter right away. It took Skull Knight pointing out that he had survivors from the eclipse to look after that Zodd realised what was going on here. He was both shocked and impressed that Guts managed to live through that veritable nightmare, because he was the first person that managed to pull off such a feat. He fought, clawed and stabbed his way to safety, losing an arm and an eye in the process, but somehow emerging far stronger than he was before. His conviction was cemented in darkness, and Zodd was thrilled by the prospect of meeting him again. He knew that all of Guts' battles up until this point in life were meaningless, because now his true battle begun. As a branded individual, his life would be a living nightmare, and he he'd have to fight to survive without a moment's rest or peace. That kind of lifestyle changes a person's mental health for the worse, but it improves their physical stats by outlandish levels. Zodd knew Guts would emerge as a far better warrior than he was going in, so he called a temporary truce with Skull Knight and even advised him to get out of the place before the eclipse disbanded, lest he wished to be overrun by apostles. The Immortal One salivated at the mouth, thinking about fighting the future Black Swordsman, so he bade him farewell, and, in his own way, good luck. Zodd had accomplished all that he set out to do all those years ago when he first met Guts and Griffith. As soon as he realised that the latter was fated to become a god hand, he put events into motion that would ensure his ascension and took out any obstacles in his path, including apostles. He gave himself a little treat by ensuring Guts' survival, because ultimately everything Zodd did was in the pursuit of the abstract concept of absolute strength. Guts was by far the most impressive candidate in his eyes, especially because he wasn't a supernatural entity like Skull Knight. He was human to the core, and that's what was so exciting about him to Zodd. Guts had only his skills, technique, and intuition as a warrior to rely on whenever they engaged each other. He had to give it his all just to block one blow from Zodd, and yet, no matter how many times he was knocked down, he always got back up. With enough time and training, he'd become a demon in human skin himself, and that's the guy Zodd wanted to face. Once Griffith had been reborn, the Immortal One resumed old patterns. He started seeking out battlefields and decimating entire troop regiments for his personal entertainment. He knew the God Hand was planning something, but now that he'd played his part, all he could do was wait and work on his own agenda. Zodd never stopped looking for the strongest one in the realm of men, but to his surprise, and ours, the answer came from the inhuman world. 2 years after Griffith became Femto, Zodd was rewarded for his efforts with his heart's desire, albeit in a way that none of us could have foreseen. The Immortal One's greatest desire, why Zodd agreed to join Griffith and his battles with Guts. After facilitating Griffith's birth and Guts' escape, Zodd vanishes from the story for about 2 years. In that time, we're introduced to the Holy Iron Chain Knights, we follow up on Guts' time as the Black Swordsman, and most importantly, we receive the prophecy of the Falcon. Now, this prophecy is at the heart of what occurs in Berserk post-eclipse. It basically traces the rebirth of Griffith as Femto and recognizes it as the starting point of the Age of Darkness. Zodd, as the facilitator of his eclipse, becomes one of its heralds, and that becomes clear in the Revelations trio of chapters. Those chapters are meant to forecast the immediate and distant future of Midland, neither of which is particularly bright. As war and disease ravages its towns and cities, Midlanders are united by their common desire for salvation from their suffering. This desire will be so huge that it will facilitate the incarnation of a god hand into the physical world. As the one that opened Griffith's eyes to his true destiny, Zodd was chosen as his right hand of doom, and Femto decided to grace him with a private audience. As he was slaying yet another regiment of 300 troops in chapter 128, Zodd pondered if he would ever succeed in his life's mission. He had stood before men and apostles many times in his life, but somehow none could satisfy him. In the end, only Skull Knight measured up to his expectations. Guts was on his way there, and he had killed many an apostle too, but in the end, neither were what Zodd desired. No sooner had he thought that a blinding white falcon appeared in front of him. This huge bird of prey existed not within the physical world. It was a part of the subconscious, the space between reality and dreams. As soon as he heard that description, Zodd realized what it was. He knew that the God Hand existed in the exact same space, and given that the form in front of him was that of a falcon, it could only mean one thing. The Fifth himself was giving Zodd an audience. The Immortal was confused as to why this was occurring. He had done nothing to offend the God Hand. If anything, he'd been their most faithful servant, removing the obstacle called Wild from Griffith's path to ascension and sending souls aplenty straight to hell. He asked Femto why he was revealing himself like this, an air of panic evident in his voice. That panic gave way to anticipation when Femto told him that word words weren't what he desired. Zodd recognized a challenge when he heard one, and he didn't care that he was about to fight his natural superior. The gauntlet had been thrown down by God himself, so he wasn't in violation of any of the God Hand's tenets. He acknowledged the challenge and transformed into his released state, intending to find his definition of absolute strength on that day, and to his shock, he did. It was the effortlessness with which he was disabled that left Zodd baffled. As soon as he broke out of his armor, the falcon flew right through him. It sliced off his left horn, the very same horn that Guts had targeted in their first battle, and cut through his head as well. But when Zodd recovered, he seemed fine, to the point he wondered whether all of it had been a dream. The evidence presented itself at his feet, where his severed horn lay, and a gash opened up on his head to solidify the experience further. Zodd accepted his defeat wordlessly. He had tried standing up to God himself, and been humbled without even so much as a modicum of effort. Griffith was in an entirely different plane of existence, and his chosen form was that of a bird, and yet Zodd could do nothing to stop its metaphysical onslaught. He knew that if he couldn't defeat Griffith in the subconscious space, then there was no hope for him in the physical world, and so he admitted defeat silently and listened to his new instructions. He was to find the holy ground where the blind sheep would erect a pillar of fire, because that is the place where the desired would come. That phrase has a different meaning for everyone in the world of Berserk. For the common people, it means a desire for salvation, for a saviour that would liberate them from the ills of war. For apostles, it means the manifestation of their literal Lord in a domain where they would have no choice but to cleave to him. For Zodd, it meant that he would finally have a chance to stand beside the absolute definition of strength, and being a dutiful apostle, he accepted his new post. The Immortal One paid a visit to St. Albion, where he once again engaged his rival Skull Knight in a battle. Like most of their encounters, we're not shown the actual fight, just given the result of it, which is yet another stalemate. That's because it turns out Zodd abandoned the fight and ran to Griffith like a moth attracted to light the moment his incarnation was completed. Zodd didn't actually facilitate things during this temporal junction. In fact, he was pretty much an observer. But his arrival at its end marked the beginning of the new world, because as soon as Griffith revealed his new form of flesh, Zodd knelt to him in total obedience. He protected his god and king from the onslaught of Bakiraka scouts, who were on a mission of their own. They had been instructed by their king to capture the Falcon of Light, aka Griffith, and being the Falcon's right wing, Zodd couldn't allow that. He slaughtered every Bakiraka trying to force their way past him to get to Griffith, and created a pile of corpses by the time he and his master withdrew. From that moment onward, Nosferatu Zodd became the personal vehicle and bodyguard of the God Hand on Earth, Femto. Now, many might have questioned just why someone as powerful as Zodd would just bend the knee like that. He's the only apostle that has been shown to be capable of cheating death time and again. He can fight on all three terrains, and he has the benefit of having centuries of battle experience. Zodd can break down the precise path that a fight is going to take, because he has honed his senses to pick up on such things over the years. These skills are necessary when your goal is as ambitious as fighting the absolute strongest being alive, but none of it prepared him for the actual event. When Zodd went up against the strongest, all his training, all his senses ended up betraying him. Griffith fought him in a domain where Zodd had no control, and he had all of it. He beat his mark so easily that Zodd might as well be a pro wrestling jobber to him, but to the Immortal, this was his one chance, and he failed. To a warrior with a shred of honor, such a defeat entrusts his life in the hands of the one that beat him, and so it was with Zodd and Griffith. By defeating him, Griffith owned his life, and Zodd had no qualms with that. He was already his natural master. Now he had proven himself be worthy of that distinction. Being in the service of the strongest, it was Zodd's duty to ensure his vision came to life, and the Immortal One dedicated himself to it with aplomb. It also had the added advantage of putting him in the front lines of every conflict that was to come, be it against humans or inhumans. Though he had been bested, Zodd's thirst for blood was far from being satiated, and his best chance to work towards it was by working with Griffith. The Falcon planned to dominate all worlds, not just the physical world, and such an ambitious plan would come with its fair share of challenges. Zodd was more than happy to meet those challenges head on, because that was his new purpose in life. As his first demonstration of loyalty, he helped his master deal with an old thorn that had long been bothering both their sides: guts. Bringing a god hand into the physical world is not something that can happen every century, or even once every millennium. It is a process that requires a massive mobilization of sacrificial souls as well as astral energy. By making the egg of the perfect world his vessel, Griffith was going to essentially recreate his human form and imbue it with his powers as a god hand. That included his frozen heart, which allowed him to negate the influence of disastrous external factors like feelings and emotions. When he became a god hand, Griffith sacrificed his own humanity, and as a result, he felt nothing when his fallen soldiers' souls pierced through his. His first order of business post-incarnation was to confirm if things still worked that way, and for the most part, they did. Griffith had Zodd take him to the Hill of Swords so he could face the only surviving members of his band and see if he still felt something. He came face to face with Rickett, the only man that wasn't there that day, and instead of owning up to his sins, he just chatted him up like nothing had happened. It took Guts' arrival for the truth to come out, but before that, the two former comrades were long due for a confrontation. Ever since he became a God Hand member, Guts had only gotten one opportunity to get to Griffith. That was when he entered the Behelit domain, along with Slugcount and his daughter Teresia. Back then, he was completely powerless in front of Griffith because he was in Griffith's world. The God Hand are profound metaphysical beings whose existence is tied into the very fabric of the astral world. Trying to kill them in the astral world was like trying to make water wet or fight dust with dust. Guts put on a valiant performance, but he might as well have been signing up for voluntary torture. Now that he was in the physical world, however, things were different. He was within the Black Swordsman's reach, and Guts couldn't wait to get his hands on the guy. He charged Griffith after brushing aside his unsettling game of familiarity, but before he could get there, the Falcon's new rabid dog arrived on the scene to protect his master. Zodd showed up and greeted Guts as though they'd known each other for centuries. He was excited, you see. 2 years ago, he let Guts head off into the night with Skull Knight, intent on seeing how he would live through the carnage that was to follow. Since then, the Black Swordsman had slain apostle after apostle, honing his body and mind for the sole purpose of extinguishing all demon kind. That kind of a life changes a man's heart, but it makes his blade sharper than ever. The Dragon Slayer was a blunt-edged sword, but in Guts' hands, it was an arc of death. The swordsman was confused seeing Zodd with Griffith, unable to work out the nature of their connection, but Zodd made it clear with what he said next. He told Guts that words lacked elegance, and he needed to force his way past him if he wanted to get to the master. To the Black Swordsman, all Zodd was in his way, so they engaged one another, and what followed is perhaps their best battle yet. Both Guts and Zodd danced on the edge of death, keeping each other on their toes and using the environment to their advantage. Guts was armed with a sword more powerful, but more cumbersome than the one he had in their previous fight. Zodd had a loincloth on this time, but he was fighting with a Kushan Remdao that he borrowed on his way to the hill. Their first encounter was a stalemate, with both sides jockeying for an opening, but not being able to find one. When Guts creates separation, Zodd expresses his amazement at the man's skills, calling them magnificent. You have to understand, for Nosferatu Zodd to say such a thing, one has to be in a league of their own as a warrior. He has fought every kind of person and monster there is to fight. He has made the Wandering Wraith himself his personal enemy, and yet, here he was, faced with a human that was matching not just his skill, but his strength as well. Guts managed to crack Zodd's blade in their second engagement, so the Immortal One quickly improvised and used one of the swords that Rickett forged as a grave marker to double up. He unleashed a wild flurry of attacks that Guts countered, kicking another grave marker into his belly. Both men had nearly taken each other's heads off, but this time, when they separated, Zodd more or less admitted defeat. In his base form, they were equally matched, and Guts had made his weapon pretty much useless. The Immortal One knew that assuming his release state was unfair, and he wanted to relish that sword fight a bit longer. But he also knew that Guts was a seasoned apostle killer now, unlike their first encounter, which was his maiden meeting with one, so he unleashed his released form and leapt at him once again. Several factors played into the Black Swordsman's favour, the first of which was the open battleground. Zodd's first fight with Guts was in a closed citadel courtyard filled with pillars which restricted both personal mobility and the movement of weapons. This time, they were out in the open, and Guts could dodge his heart out. He started by sidestepping Zodd and cutting through his abdomen with Dragon Slayer. It had taken both him and Griffith to do such a thing that first time they fought Zodd, but Guts was far stronger now and had more experience dealing with monsters. His weapon was a massive upgrade as well, because Dragon Slayer's size and weight made it the perfect apostle killer. With this, he had killed demons with exoskeleton harder than armor, so Zodd's furry body was nothing. When the Immortal tried charging at the Black Swordsman, Guts dodged once again and sent Zodd crashing into a mine. If he kept on the defensive in a similar fashion, he could have incapacitated Zodd, but just then, his own weakness showed up. Casca entered the battlefield, mindlessly searching for him, and nearly got caught in the blast of debris that Zodd sent flying into the sky as he rose. The Immortal had Guts cornered, who was too helpless to even defend himself in the moment, but he was called off by Griffith. The Falcon had involuntarily saved Casca from her death, and that spooked him to no end. He figured this was because of her demon child, who had fused into his incarnation vessel, but he didn't want to give anything away. Griffith came here to discover if he had any weaknesses, and now that he knew he did, he needed to retreat and come up with a containment plan. Zodd wasn't exactly thrilled to be cutting his battle with Guts short. He was having the time of his life, dancing with this supremely skilled swordsman, wanting to get his fill of the fight, but ultimately, he served Griffith without question. When his master told him to withdraw, Zodd did, and the pair flew off to get started on Griffith's vision for a kingdom. As part of this vision, the Immortal One became Griffith's first and most trusted recruit. The Falcon knew that he was going to need human assistance at some point in his campaign to gain legitimacy, but his prophecy implied that both humans and apostles would help pave his path. He couldn't have asked for a better first recruit from the latter group of folks, because can you imagine Wild or Rosine being Griffith's right-hand person? With Zodd, he gained the ability to instantly annihilate entire armies, because as we know, killing a few hundred men was just a day's work for him. He also gained the discretion of an apostle that was truly in the know about things, which made Zodd all the more important. As demons, both of them served the cosmic will of the idea of evil, but Zodd was the only one of his kind who seemed to possess a thimbleful of sense about what was happening and why. He knew how God hands are created, he knows about causality enough to help influence it, and he knows the secrets of the astral world. If Griffith wanted to launch any sort of covert mission that his human subjects couldn't know about, Zodd would be the centerpiece of his plans, and that's exactly how things play out. The duo hits up Shet, a city under siege by Kushan forces in Western Midland, as the first target of their liberation campaign. Griffith flies into the middle of the battlefield and kills the general, while Zodd sweeps down a hill, killing dozens with each step his horse took. As he worked his way to the center, he was joined by Locus, Grunbeld, Rakshas, and a bunch of other apostles, all of whom made swift work of the Kushan army contingent. The battle was won by the end of the day, and all apostles bent their knee to Griffith, pledging their allegiance to him. Zodd was front and center, and his actions got him named a captain of the reborn band of the Falcon. Though we don't know which division he headed up officially, we can make an educated guess and say it was the aerial division. First off, Zodd is the only one of Griffith's generals that can fly. Grunbeld is a flame dragon, but he's four-legged, wingless, and weighs literal tons. Irvine and Locus have ground-based forms as well, and Rakshas needs to unleash his maximum power to simulate flight. Zodd is the most natural aerial fighter of them all, and being the strongest in Griffith's entire army, he's a natural fit for being the captain of Griffith's aerial unit. In the early days of the Liberation campaign, Zodd is his master's shadow. On the front lines, he leads his men as ruthlessly as he slays his enemies. He doesn't care for anything besides completing the mission, and if any apostle tries to step out of line, Zodd doesn't hesitate from making their mistakes stick permanent. When they're not in the field, Zodd can be found just a few meters away from Griffith, overseeing every person that comes to meet him and keeping an eye out for enemy ambushes. He's a first-hand witness to Griffith's miracle of communing with souls, and he's a front-seat audience member for all his political shenanigans. After Shet, Zodd helps liberate Lumias and gives the reborn band of the Falcon a real footing in Midland. Even his apostle brethren find him to be an enigma, because despite being on the same side, Zodd doesn't speak much and likes to keep his own company. This makes sense, considering his aim to fight the strongest warriors in the world, and now many of those warriors are seemingly his brothers in arms. We can just imagine Zodd itching to test himself against Grunbeld in his released form, given that he's a gigantic corundum-skinned, flame-breathing dragon. But he practices restraint because starting internal conflicts doesn't reflect well on a captain. Perhaps the reason he doesn't communicate with his fellow ranked officers is because he's too busy thinking of all the ways in which he could kill them. And, if that turns out to be the case, we'll be the first ones to tell you that we aren't surprised. Eventually, after gaining a favourable position in Midland, Griffith decides to sick his new mad dog on his biggest problem in the material world, Flora. Since being reborn as a God Hand member, Griffith's knowledge of all things astral has reached a point where he could give the great gurus of Elfhelm a lesson or few. He knows things about the very fabric of the universe that most men can only dream of, and this knowledge also points his enemies out to him. In order to bring the entire world under his control, Griffith needed to be in control of all its sources of power. He knew that Flora, despite her age, was a skilled enough witch to put a permanent obstacle in the path of his conquest. He needed to get rid of her quickly and ensure the destruction of her spirit tree as well, but he couldn't exactly let his human followers know about any of this. In essence, what Griffith commissioned here was a brutal assassination. If he wanted to be accepted as a just and fair ruler, he couldn't be seen killing old women now, could he? Yet, at the same time, dealing with Flora and other powerful magic users was paramount, because they were unknown elements that Griffith couldn't account for, no matter how well he can interpret causality's flow. So he hands this important mission solely to his war demons, and puts Zodd in charge of the whole thing. Griffith sends in both Zodd and Grunbeld's units for Operation Spirit Mansion, just to be on the safe side, and the latter protests his mission like we thought he would. Grunbeld became an apostle because of a twisted notion of glory. His mother had drilled into his head that death in battle was the only honourable way to die, and in his final moments, Grunbeld acted more as a bunker wall than a machine gun. He took down scores of Tudor soldiers defending his lover, but when she died, he realised he'd let his mother and his ancestors down. He wanted to go out on his own terms, and the God Hand reincarnated him as an apostle, but they didn't exactly explain his new nature to him. This explains why he acts like a knight despite being a demonic being. But unlike Grunbeld, Zodd knows what's at stake, so he doesn't bat an eye at his master's request. In fact, when his soldiers start goofing off because of the arrival of Guts and Skull Knight, he kills one of them to ensure the mission stays on course. Zodd and Grunbeld's soldiers scatter off to look for Flora, and both of them prepare to engage their targets, Skull Knight and Guts respectively. Once again, we do not get to witness the glory of a battle between Skull Knight and Zodd, but the one that was unfolding between Guts and Grunbeld gave both warriors immense pause. This is because about halfway through the fight, Guts breaks out the Berserker armour to tip the scales, and the sight of it makes Zodd feel nostalgic. We're pretty sure Zodd has never fought a person that wore the Berserker in real time. Guts obtains it in front of him, and its previous owner, Skull Knight, last used it 1,000 years ago. Between that time, it was safely sealed away with Flora, and robbing her is as easy as eating glass with a paper straw. Zodd is nothing if not knowledgeable, however, and he knows about Skull Knight's past as King Geiseric. When he sees the Berserk, he instantly realises that Ghost Geiseric has condemned Guts to the same path to hell as himself, but for the sake of amusement, he pauses their battle once again and bears witness to the birth of a new Berserker. We don't get to see his reactions to Guts versus Grunbeld, Berserk mode, but we imagine Zodd spilling more of that mouth juice at the prospect of fighting Berserker Guts. As a human in control of his being, the Black Swordsman had proven himself to be the greatest swordsman alive, but as a Berserker, he could match an apostle's strength on their terms. And this changed the game entirely. Zodd would have loved to given this new whip a test drive himself, but he was on a mission that was more important in the moment. Besides, Guts' feral state lasted only for a few minutes, after which he regained his sanity and escaped with his companions. Flora died due to the fire that was set to her mansion, and turned into a demon, which made her less of a current problem and more of a future problem. Demons, like the God Hand, mostly exist within the astral world, so unless someone is skilled enough to commune with them and manifest their spirits, they remain confined to that realm. So even if they are powerful enough to check demonkind, they can't help unless they've been invoked. And we haven't seen that ritual take place yet in the series, so it must have some insane risks. With the battle won, Zodd went back to Griffith and resumed his responsibilities as a falcon until he was dispatched on the second covert war demon mission, the one to deceive Ganishka. Eliminating astral targets was relatively easy for the reborn falcons, because these were isolated fights that much of the outside world wasn't even sure occurred. But to gain legitimacy as a ruler, Griffith needed to win the affection of the people, and he needed to do it the right way. If he forced his authority on folks, they'd never follow him, and his dream would die a second time. Luckily for him, he'd laid the groundwork for the same as a human, that being seducing Princess Charlotte. Griffith played the role of the perfect white knight to the princess, keeping his real face hidden from her and charming her into falling for him, all because he knew she was his key to the throne. If he married Charlotte, he'd become king consort and rule beside her, and because he could manipulate her easily, he'd be the one ruling in truth. When he bungled all that because of Guts' departure, Griffith must have thought he'd forever lost his opportunity. We can only imagine his relief when he returned from the astral world and Charlotte was still as crazy about him as she was all those years ago. With the death of her father, she became acting Queen of Midland when the Kushan invaded. Ganishka had her imprisoned in the Tower of Rebirth, but he spread false rumours about her whereabouts and status of living so as to dissuade dissenters from searching for her. They did so regardless. And once Griffith had Charlotte's location, he made his move. He sent in his War Demon Lancer unit into Wyndham through the front gate as a distraction. Locus, Irvine and their boys kept Ganishka and his forces tied up, while Griffith and Zodd carried out the real mission. Breaking into the top floor of the Tower of Rebirth, they rescued Princess Charlotte and her maid Anna, with Zodd spiriting them away by flying their bed to safety. Charlotte thought it was a dream. Ganishka knew it was a nightmare, but to Zodd, all this was a part of his duty. He fought his master's greatest threat, rescued the woman that could get him his throne, all because in return, he could keep testing himself against new and unknown threats, over and over again. Things were confined to the physical world for now, and so were Zodd's targets, but that wouldn't be the case forever. As his right-hand man, Zodd must have known Griffith was planning to merge the physical and astral worlds together, and his silence on the matter was his greatest contribution. The war with Ganishka was pretty much a farce. Griffith could have ended it the day he incarnated, because all apostles, no matter how powerful, are insects in the face of a god hand. But he kept the guy alive because he clearly needed him for something. That didn't mean Griffith was about to let him go scot-free, because a broken enemy was far more willing to listen than a stubborn. He had been chipping away at Ganishka's forces, reclaiming land for Midlanders, and carefully building his army and public persona so he could strike at the opportune moment. That wouldn't be possible if Ganishka took over the seat of the Holy See, so he sent Zodd to deal with the problem, like he always does. The Immortal One fully intended to carry out his duty and bring his master his enemy's head, like he always does. But this is also where a curious wrinkle is introduced in the bloody tale of Zodd. Unclear prophecies and unlikely allies. The Immortal, the Falcon, the Berserker, and his bride. From the time he became an apostle to the time he was dispatched to Vritannis to dispel an attack by Ganishka and his supernatural beasts, every decision Zodd had made was in service of finding his definition of absolute strength. The Immortal One was aware of the fact that causality wasn't as concrete in nature as most believed it to be. Choice played a major part in it. And it's those choices that the God Hand and apostles like him seek to manipulate. But in a way, Zodd might believe he had no choice, because his entire life had been boiled down to achieving one goal. Whichever path was the best suited to attaining that goal, Zodd would take, making his total number of choices 1 out of 1. But around the time of his deployment to Vritannis, causality decided to reassert its MCQ-esque nature to the Immortal One by directly presenting him with a choice. Zodd had proven his worth many times over by being Griffith's first soldier, then his first captain, his first line of defence, as well as his chosen mode of transportation. His quest for the absolute strongest had been fulfilled by his natural superior, and now he lived just to savour the fight. His hopes for a glorious death lie in the hands of Skull Knight and Guts, and funnily enough, the choice he had to make involved them as well. Shortly before deployment, Zodd was approached by Griffith's spiritual medium, Sonia. Sonia is a girl Griffith rescued during the assault on Shet, and, realizing her spiritual powers, turned into an ally. Sonia has the uncanny ability to read the flow of life forces, perceive things only highly skilled mages can, and perform thought transference at will, without needing a go-between like a thread. But above all, her greatest power is her ability to spit out prophecies. It happens at random, and Sonia doesn't seem to be in control of it, but when she's in prophecy mode, her eyes glaze over, and she often tells the people she's speaking with what lies in their future. When Sonia befriended Shrieker, after a day of adventuring in Vritannis, her oracle powers told the girl that they would meet again one day. When she snapped out of it, she didn't seem to realise what she'd just said. It was the same with Zodd, only this time she was presenting him with an actual choice. Where he was going, Zodd would be faced with a blade that had cut his flesh in the past. It would be upon him to decide whether he wants to continue his baser search for stronger enemies, or use that weapon to his advantage. Either way, he was going to be in for the fight of his life, because the God Hand had heard his plea and decided to present him with the actual strongest apostle in the world. Zodd and his aerial unit entered Vritannis' airspace and wasted no time in chasing the raging thundercloud that hung over its bay, because that was their target. The thundercloud was the released form of the dread Emperor Ganishka, and Zodd's orders were to take him down while the rest cleaned up the streets. The Immortal One didn't enter this fight without a plan. He had directed his soldiers to circle around Ganishka and flap their wings at him in unison, hoping to dispel his released state. Ganishka's mist was created by wind and water elementals that he subdued with his astral body using dark spells, and the more moisture there was in the air, the stronger he would become. But he was essentially a sentient thundercloud at the end of the day, so a strong enough gust of wind should blow him off. Unfortunately, lightning strikes faster than the naked eye can see, and Zodd lost many of his soldiers in the first pass itself. He survived 2 more direct lightning strikes, and his men tried executing the plan, but it was to no avail. They were far weaker than Zodd was, and many of them had been one shot to hell by Ganishka. The Immortal One was running out of ideas, besides making continuous passing at the Kushan Emperor's body in the hope of breaking it while absorbing lightning, which, by the 3rd bolt, he looked like someone's dinner, so you can guess how long he'd be able to hold out beyond that. This is when the choice presented itself to him in the form of Guts. Unbeknownst to Zodd, the Black Swordsman and his allies were also present in Vritannis the night Ganishka decided to take over, and they'd already done a bulk of his job for him. Guts and his crew took down pirates, Pishacha, all of the Makra, the Kundalini, as well as its rider and Ganishka's wizard general, Daiba. Guts was in the middle of a battle with Ganishka himself when Zodd arrived, and though the respite was welcome, the intrusion was not. When Zodd crashed down to Earth after getting struck by lightning a 3rd time, Guts climbed onto his back in what has to be the most bizarre moment in the timeline of their relationship. These 2 men want to kill each other the moment they realise they're in each other's vicinity. Zodd wants to do it because Guts is the greatest sport he's found in his life this side of Skull Knight. Guts wants to do it because ever since the day Zodd showed up in his life, nothing was the same, and he would like to amend that no matter how late it is. Yet, in that moment, the 2 of them had different goals and a common enemy. Like Zodd, Guts had also been zapped numerous times by Ganishka's lightning, but unlike Zodd, he didn't have apostle healing to rely on for his injuries. Guts couldn't stand another thunderstrike, so he decided that he would hitch a ride before that happened. For his part, it took all of Zodd's willpower to not kill Guts on the spot. His neck bristled with excitement when he sensed the Black Swordsman's bloodlust, but like we told you guys, he had much bigger problems at hand. Zodd wanted Guts to get off so he could deal with the problem himself, but Guts insisted on doing it together. When Zodd flew them from beneath a broken mast, the Black Swordsman switched from requesting requesting to threatening, and put Dragon Slayer to Zodd's neck. Guts wanted to let him know that his flight could end any moment if he wanted it to, but in showing him the weapon from Sonya's prophecy, he also made Zodd's choice for him. The Immortal One took one look at Dragon Slayer, recalled the medium's words, and mentally told himself off for not picking up on it sooner. He agrees to this momentary team up with Guts, but only if he can actually hack the Thundercloud into pieces. With a little help from Shrieker and Dragon Slayer, he does just that, though not before both him and Zodd crash to shore, singed half to death. Zodd is the first to recover, of course, being the Apostle with the fastest healing factor, but now that he'd defeated the undefeatable Apostle, he wanted to keep the winning streak going. Zodd demanded that Guts get up and fight him, because those were the terms of their agreement. They would work together temporarily to get through a common hurdle, but as soon as that was over, they would settle things once and for all. Zodd warned Guts that he would tear him apart if he did not rise, even though he could see that the man was nearing death's door. And then, to everyone's shock, Guts stood up, Dragon Slayer in hand, and antagonized Zodd into trying to fight him. The Immortal One took one look at his rival and decided better of it, postponing their fight for a day when they were both in better shape. When Guts asked Griffith's whereabouts, Zodd warned him not to pursue that end, otherwise he'd sick every single apostle in Britannis onto Guts. So he didn't pursue it, and they parted ways, having cooperated for the first time in their lives. If we're being honest with ourselves, Zodd and Guts would make a duo that could give nightmares to nightmares. With their combined skill, strength, technique, and resilience, replicating the 100-man Slayer feat would be a piece of cake. We never thought Zodd and Guts would be able to put their differences aside and actually work together. But then again, Zodd did let Guts live after the eclipse, just as a challenge for himself down the line. This time, he says that he wishes for them to bloody each other to their heart's content, and that wouldn't exactly be possible with Guts as fried as Kentucky chicken. This act of cooperation can be an isolated event, or part of a greater fate for Zodd that he himself is unaware of. See, after the victory at Britannis, Zodd returned to his regular duties. He became Griffith's leading general for the final battle with Ganishka, and was the first war demon to jump into action against Ganishka's pseudos. Zodd kept fighting on the front lines until it was time for his master to usher in the new world. He flew Griffith to the top of Ganishka's head, high up in the skies, and landed at the nexus point of the Emperor's consciousness. Remember how we told you guys that Griffith needed Ganishka alive? Well, turns out it wasn't just to orchestrate a crushing defeat for the man, or to taunt him before the inevitable. Griffith knew that Ganishka wasn't the kind of person who would get some breathing space and not use it to his advantage. He survived a pit of political snakes growing up by being the strongest viper around, and given even slight wiggle room, he was sure to think of a way out for himself. That way was to boost his power artificially by plunging himself into the man-made Behelit. But Ganishka had no idea that he was doing exactly what the God Hand wanted him to do. They had tried to make an apostle ascend a second time and become the beast of the end in the Black Swordsman arc, but that failed because the apostle made a different choice. This time, the God Hand arranged things to play out in such a way that Ganishka reincarnating again would be his choice. Only the consequences would be what Griffith intended. When Ganishka entered the man-made Behelit, he pulled in enormous amounts of astral energy into himself, enough to turn his insides into a portal to the abyss. With the right tool, Griffith could open that portal, put the world in a massive interstice, and control everything using his powers, which would be stronger after the merger, presumably. That tool presented itself in the form of Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation, and this is the only time in the entire series that we've seen Zodd getting caught off guard. Usually, he's so on his game that even if a fly threatened him, he would eliminate the target with chilling precision. But in this moment, he didn't anticipate his master getting ambushed like that. Neither did he notice Rakshas, who had blended into the shadows of his wings to get a front row seat to the birth of the new world. As soon as Zodd realized what was happening, he charged at Skull Knight, but for the first time in his life, he didn't have to. Turns out, Griffith was waiting for this all along, because the sword strike from Skull Knight's Sword of Actuation was the key to opening the abyssal portal within Shiva Ganishka. Once those two things came into contact, the world transformed and entered a state of fantasia where every magical beast that humanity had ever thought up came into existence. Dragons, krakens, leviathans, giants, hydras, they all became real, and this was the greatest gift that Zodd's master could have given him. The next time we see him, he's with the Band of the Falcon in the New World, leading an offensive against Jotuns. The Band of the Falcon had located the Jotun leader, but these giants had managed to somehow capture a hydra. They set it loose on the Falcons, and that's when Zodd jumped in. The Immortal One immediately went for the hydra's heads, keeping it busy while his comrades moved into position. Irvine riddled them with his organic arrows, while Grunbeld burnt the hydra's mangled body to a crisp, ensuring it didn't regenerate. Once the raid was over, the band returned to Falconia using sky paths that Griffith and Sonia discovered, and we once again lose track of Zodd until Griffith attacks Elfhelm. The Falcon infiltrates the island stronghold in the form of the Moonlight Boy, which allows him to enter undetected. Once the Moonlight Boy's body sharing time is over, however, he reverts to his original body, thereby transmitting a signal across the world. Griffith holds off a maddened Guts long enough for Zodd to take those aforementioned sky paths to Elfhelm and engage the swordsmen in their third proper battle. Well, calling it a proper battle is an overstatement, because all Zodd did was hold off his adversary long enough for Griffith to work his magic. The God Hand member took Casca into his custody because, as the mother of the demon child within him, she was his only external weakness. Every night of a full moon, the demon child would take over his body through their shared vessel, track down its mother, and spend time with her, yearning for the warmth of a parent. It had only happened a handful of times so far, but if this was a permanent thing, then Griffith needed a permanent solution. What is more permanent than turning your trigger into your prisoner? So he decides to do just that, and takes Casca hostage. He then breaks Skellig Island into two with his spatial powers, and destroys its cherry blossom spirit tree as well. With their anchor to the physical world gone, every magical being that resided on Elfhelm disappears, leaving only death and despair in their wake. Zodd hurries Griffith back to Falconia, where they are greeted by Sonia, Mule, Irvine, Grunbeld, and Locus. The last of those three don't even flinch at the fact that their master has returned from an inexplicable absence with an unconscious woman, but Sonia's eyes immediately light up. We still haven't seen what she deduces in that moment, but we have seen Zodd, and let us tell you, he does not appear to be in a good mood. The Immortal One's last appearance was in chapter 372, and to say that he's looking grumpy and secretive would be a fairly accurate summary. He's there for a single page and in a chapter filled with intrigues. The one surrounding his dissatisfied face is the one we're curious about most. If you've read the chapter, you will notice that the rest of Griffith's generals are bowing at his feet, but Zodd is off in the back, lurking in the shadows, listening in on everything that's being said and seemingly disapproving of it. It's a chance as slim as a strand of hair. But could it be that Zodd is second-guessing throwing in with Griffith? The evidence would seem to suggest so. Ever since Sonia came up to him with a choice, he hasn't felt like himself, and maybe there's more to it than we realise. Griffith's next target is the Kushan Empire, because it is the only human civilization in the world that managed to withstand the onslaught of Fantasia, and also knows the truth about Griffith. At the beginning of this video, we speculated that Zodd himself could be from the East, so it's possible the look on his face is concern for a home he left long ago. It is also possible that somehow Griffith has done something that really doesn't sit well with Zodd, and he's rethinking the whole causality is concrete ideal. He already made a choice to resist his nature and serve the greater good when he allied with Guts. That showed him that maybe his choices are what will make an impact on the new world. Before becoming a war demon captain, Zodd had a goal and a plan on how to make it happen. He worked towards that goal for 3 centuries, until his innate nature caught up to him and activated his contract's thraldom clause. He has obeyed Griffith without question ever since, and even killed apostles in his name to maintain peace and precision. But will that continue when he realises the truth about Casca and Sonia? Though we haven't seen what happened to her, we know Sonia is the jealous type. Griffith and Charlotte don't even do PDA, and she hates the duckling princess for trying to steal away her falcon. Seeing the man of his dreams carrying Casca in his arms as though she was the woman of his made her eyes gape, and in that moment perhaps Sonia came to to a much-needed realization. Zodd doesn't exactly have a relationship with her life, Irvine does, but they do share a sort of bond forged by prophecy. If Griffith did something to Sonya to keep Casca in check, then Zodd's grumpiness makes a whole hell of a lot more sense. But the real question is, what's next? Things are running smoother than butter for the Falconians at the moment. Their city is the only one in the world, apart from the Kushan Empire, that is fully functional and well protected from evil spirits. At least the ones that aren't demonic reincarnates anyway. They've pretty much subdued all mankind west of Midland and are now working on reclaiming living space and building fortresses along the way to claim all available land. Zodd helped them remove all astral obstacles with his spirit tree missions, and as of this moment, he might be preparing for an unwanted homecoming. Chapter 376 told us that Griffith's forces had already reached the western border of the Kushan Empire. Silat meant to fight them out in the field, and with Guts incapacitated, he's their best swordsman. But even Silat won't stand a chance against the enemy if Zodd is a part of their mission. We suspect Zodd to be involved in the Eastern Exile chapter sooner or later, but one thing is for certain. When he does, death will follow, as it always does. It's just a matter of figuring out to whom it gets dished out to. Marvelous verdict. What's next for the battlefield god? Will he die? Nosferatu Zodd has been a massive part of Berserk since its earliest days, so to think that his character might conclude the series without proper closure feels almost criminal. The Immortal One's entire life has been about the pursuit of absolute strength, but it also feels like a massive lie. Choices trump fate, kidnapping is welcomed, and nothing is as sacred as the thrill of the fight. For 3 centuries, Zodd has roamed this earth looking for a challenge that can finally put him in the ground, and it will be a shame to give his character an ending that doesn't address that. So what's next for him? Well, it depends on the direction Studio Gaga decides to take. Right now, Griffith is headed for the Kushan Empire, and Zodd's next move could be joining the campaign. It could also be sabotaging the campaign, considering everything we've just said. But let's keep that aside. When an author names his character immortal, 9 times out of 10 that character's fate is to die, the 10th being a misprint. It's been clear to us since day one that Zodd will eventually get what's coming to him, but now we don't know if it will be thanks to Guts or Skull Knight, if it will be the both of them or someone else entirely. But it doesn't matter even if Zodd dies in the story, because he has carved out a permanent lair in our hearts and minds. He is by far the most iconic villain from Berserk, whose name doesn't start with a G, and his unhinged aura is what makes us such big fans of him. In the end, Zodd will likely go out fighting a version of absolute strength, but because it will not be on his terms, he will remain dissatisfied, both in this life and the other. Whatever be the case, at least his life story will always be available to you, so you can keep in mind that no matter how lofty your ambitions in life are, they're not worth a deal with the devil in the end. The devil promises you the world in exchange for your soul, and once your perception stabilizes, you realize he's tricked you and now owns you. Zodd is doing his best to work within that framework, but he don't know how long he will hold up. We can only pray. Speaking of knowing, we would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, so don't forget to do that and spark some more debate in the intellectual circles. It was a pleasure tracking the history of the OG Apostle, and if you're ever in doubt, just remember, slow breaths and quick stabbings quite literally change the world. You've got that same power within you, and if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.